Okay, I want to try to give an introduction to this library. This is a place we call the Institute. It's kind of a joke in our family. Kate graduated from MIT. They call that the Institute. And so this is our Institute. And I want to try to give some indication of how this was put together and what tradition we feel this is part of. First of all, let me say that this library was not created simply by me. There are many people who contributed to this. Clearly, my partner Kate, she really laid out this library and designed it. But historically, this woman right here, my sister, Aisha, Sandra McWhorter, she really in Chicago, in our family home, has really maintained a lot of these archives over the years. And it's only by maintaining these archives, as I was ripping and running in the movement and moving around to different campuses, that we were able to then reassemble it here now. So I want to give major props to my sister. Then also I want to say that in varying parts of this collection, there were various colleagues and comrades that have been very essential. Just to make a point on the Malcolm collection, it started when I was doing work on Malcolm here at the University of Illinois in the 70s, and the research assistant I had when he was an undergraduate is Ramon Ocasio, who helped me put together my first bibliography, and using the great library we have here at the University of Illinois, all kinds of documents that were hard to get that we were able to get through interlibrary loan, etc. And then also a great friend and comrade, Bill Sales, who taught for a long time at Seton Hall University, and we worked together in the Malcolm X work group, and I worked with Bill when he was putting his dissertation together, which was subsequently published as a book on Malcolm X. So these are just two of the individuals, and I could name many more. I'll mention John LaRose in England, various people in other countries that have really helped me put this collection together. But there's a history to this kind of collection. There are people who were collectors whose collection became the core of a public special collection in a library system. So for example, Arturo Schomburg, an Afro-Puerto Rican, was a great collector of books, and the New York Public Library purchased his collection, and that was the beginning of the Schomburg collection in New York. But also Blockson in Philadelphia was a great collector of books. His collection was purchased by Temple University and is now the core of their African American collection. Vivian Harsh, the first African American library director in Chicago, public library system, she was a great collector and built the collection which is now known as the Vivian Harsh Collection in Chicago. So public libraries and personal collections have had a convergence. But also there are the black bookstores, because black bookstores were where locally produced material that was not part of the ISBN world and not part of the mainstream world, but were nevertheless published and circulated in the black community. That's where those documents were to be found. I remember going to the National Memorial Bookstore in New York, where Elder Michaud was the owner, and there were stacks of books in the corner, and you could literally go down the stacks and you would see the pamphlets of various generations and years and on different issues of struggle that were coming out of Harlem. And then once he took me in the basement, it was fabulous. I'm going to show you a document called, a journal called China Reconstructs. Well, he took me into the basement and showed me his collection of Ghana Reconstructs, which was a journal published by Nkrumah in Ghana, modeled after China Reconstructs, that really highlighted the Ghanaian Revolution. But then around the corner from Michaud's bookstore was the Frederick Douglass bookstore, which was on the second floor, run by Richard Moore. And Richard Moore was a very important brother who wrote that book, the pamphlet, The Evil Origins and Uses of the Name Negro. He was against using the name Negro. And as a young person in graduate school, I was able to meet and talk with both Michaud and Richard Moore in their bookstores. And then bookstores popped up all over the country. In Chicago, we had the black bookstore run by Curtis Ellis. And he was connected just 2 or 3 blocks from the University of Chicago. And we used to go and talk with him and help him build his collection. And he later came on, he had 3 bookstores. He ran the bookstores in several of the junior colleges as well. So collecting these materials really became almost an obsession with those of us who created black studies, because the institutions that we were getting our formal education in for our graduate degrees, for the most part, had faculty who were totally unaware of black intellectual history, or the fact that the black community was intellectually productive in contrast to the mainstream norm that black people were intellectually weak. And so we had to collect this material in order to demonstrate to ourselves, first and foremost, that, to use Jesse Jackson's phrase, we were somebody. And so this was really not only an obsession, but a necessary thing in order to create the curriculum of black studies, which is based on black intellectual history. It's not based on research using race, in quotes, as a variable in mainstream research. There's a difference to the organic history of how black people have dealt with the fundamental questions having to do with the black experience. Privileging an analysis of black social institutions, privileging an analysis of the radical struggle for freedom, and privileging an analysis of the voices of African Americans. And therefore, this library is not only a reflection of my personal intellectual journey, it is a testimony to that intellectual legitimacy of black intellectual history. And so we're going to walk through this collection. It's a small collection in terms of everything that's available, but for some of you it will be surprising, because it is an important collection. And I'm saying that because it's my collection, and it has to do with my research. And I'm 71 years old. I was born in 1942. And I ain't through yet. This section is a collection of most of the publications and monographs that I've written. And as you can see, we have some dates here. So it starts really in 1966 when I was in graduate school, and it goes all the way down through the current period. This includes documents like this, which is the conference program in 1982 of the National Council for Black Studies that I chaired, that we had in Chicago. That was really very successful. And in addition to the program, we have here, these are the proceedings, the several volumes that we put together of the proceedings. And this is our textbook, which has gone through 6 editions and has been used throughout the country in Black Studies programs. It started out as really a study guide and ended up as a 2-volume anthology, and then the formally written textbook. And this includes things like this Chicago lecture series that when I was, again, head of the program here, we had a lectureship series of people from Chicago that represented these different sectors. It's a very unique time because African Americans were actually leading the major institutions in the city of Chicago. And this also was just before Harold Washington announced for his candidacy as mayor in the city of Chicago. And that proved to be a very important event. So as you can see, over a career of, now we're talking over 40-some years of publications that it's possible to amass your work and have a basis for evaluating what your contribution has been. We also have a number of DVDs that reflect our, including Reboot, which was a project, a hip-hop project, and we got local cultural producers to do tracks on information technology. It's the gateway to the future. Get linked or they mute you. And so this was a very important connection between the technological revolution and the cultural production that was happening in our community. Okay, down this particular aisle, on this side, what we've got really is black history and black culture. So beginning here, we have the documentary volumes of the description of black leadership. So these are the who's who in colored America, and the Negro Yearbook that Monroe Work published at Tuskegee, which really was a annual or every 2 or 3 years volume where he would sum up all of the data, all the publications, all the statistical data, and so on about the black experience. Here we have the collected works of J.A. Rogers, who was also a great historian who chronicled and created documentary chronologies and books about the African American experience. And next to him, half of this shelf here, this is the work of Frederick Douglass. And then these 3 shelves are W.B. Du Bois and all the collections. In addition, we've got DVDs of Du Bois's life, of his voice. So we have not only his words, but his voice. And then here, for half a shelf, we have C.L.R. James and his work, the great revolutionary from Trinidad, whose important work helped us to understand the Haitian Revolution in his book, The Black Jacobins. And then underneath here we have C.L.R. James, Vincent Harding, John Hope Franklin, and other historians, recent historians. Here we have the collected works of Carter G. Woodson and of Booker T. Washington, and of other historical works, including more recent historians, particularly people like Earl Thorpe, a great historian of black intellectual history. But now moving along here, what we've got is the historical periodization. So there's 7 shelves dealing with slavery, 7 shelves dealing with the black rural experience, and another 7 shelves dealing with the black urban experience organized by cities. So there's sections on Detroit, Cleveland, New York, and so on. We have another whole 7 shelves on Chicago, which is a special focus, which is in another location. Okay, now these 7 shelves are all about education and black studies. And so we have the main histories of black studies, Biondi, Rojas, Perry Hall. We also have our Intro to African American Studies textbook. And we have the early work on black studies. But in addition to that, what we've got are the sort of documents of my own personal experience. So, for example, I taught in Berlin at the John F. Kennedy Institute, the Free University of Berlin. So we've got all that documentation. And we've got documentation from the University of Ghana. And we've got early journals, for example, the Black Studies Movement. Here's one of the rare copies of the Harvard Journal of Negro Affairs. This was part of their black studies. But then somewhere we've got what they published at Yale and at Columbia. And so this is all part of the documentation of black studies that, again, were locally produced and not that well, widely spread, and therefore to have it in your collection is really a rare and important thing. Now here we get into the civil rights movement. This is the SNCC, the NAACP, CORE, SCLC, and so on. That's here in Negro politics, black politics, the electoral struggle here. This whole half a shelf is about Jesse Jackson. Now here we get into, here are 4 or 5 shelves that deal with Martin Luther King. This includes the multi-volume study that Congress did on the assassination of King. So we not only have King's words and the bibliography that was published, a book-length bibliography on him, but we have the studies of that the government has done. Underneath here we've got 2 shelves that deal with black language behavior, Ebonics or Black English, or BEV as they call it. And so particularly featuring the work of Geneva Smitherman and her studies. Her important book, first book, was Talking and Testifying, The Language of Black America. And Geneva is a dear friend and comrade. Okay, now these 7 shelves all deal with the experiences of black women. Biographies, studies, because black women studies is very important part of black studies in general. And so most of these books privilege the voice of the African American woman, the African American woman scholar, and so on. Now these 2 shelves, these last 2 shelves here, this is black literature. So we have poetry and all of the major anthologies dealing with black poetry, and novels and studies. Not only the question of the general, but the specific. So we have the collected works of James Baldwin, the collected works of Richard Wright, the collected works of Ralph Ellison, all of which identify me as someone from the 60s because we were reading these books as they were being published. And so these are very important parts of this collection, including things like this 12 Million Black Voices. Now this is a volume that has been reprinted, but this is the original volume that comes out of my climbing and crawling through used bookstores. And so this is a very important part of collecting, is making sure you go to all the used bookstores. And of course I was collecting before it became faddish, and therefore a lot of this material was on the shelves. I remember when Attorney Huff, he was a great collector of books in Chicago. I was in graduate school, and I went to this used bookstore that was on 53rd Street, and his widow had just deposited his collection in this store. And I saw these books, and it shocked me. And I rushed home and got my rent money and rushed back to the store and came away with 4 or 5 bags of books out of this bookstore. I was a graduate student. But you can imagine the shock of not only being aware of the need to preserve this history and these publications, but the shock of actually seeing the potential destruction of a collection. And this is not the only experience that I had like that. The other experience I want to tell you about is the experience of J.H. Jackson's library. Now, J.H. Jackson was the president of the National Baptist Convention. And what a lot of people don't know is that J.H. Jackson was also an intellectual who wrote books. And his daughter became a professor of English literature at Duke University. She also wrote books. And they had an old bank building on Cottage Grove and Oakwood Boulevard. In fact, I know this bank building because it was where we had SNCC headquarters for the school boycott in Chicago. And I eventually became president of, chairman of local SNCC in Chicago, so I'm very familiar with SNCC's history. But anyway, this bank building was taken over by J.H. Jackson, and he created his own library in this bank building and had a paid librarian, staff, etc. Well, one day, For whatever reason, she walked out and left the door open, and that was it. And the homeless moved in. We had a bookstore on 43rd Street, and I was known as the bookman. And they came in and they said, "You the bookman, right?" I said, "Yeah." They said, "Well, we know where there's some books." And we went around to this book place, and it was full of books, but the homeless had moved in, and they were using some of the paper for their toilet. I reached down and picked up a piece of paper, and it was correspondence between J.H. Jackson and Martin Luther King. So you can again see the shock of seeing our history going in a way that is exactly opposite of what we wanted to have happen. We wanted it to be preserved, and we saw it being turned into trash. And so we were able to save some of those books, and but I'm sure there are many other stories that people who might see this film can tell about the how various collections of material. When I saw that piece of correspondence, it was like seeing a thread from the sacred cloth being endangered. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to preserve the collections that we've been able to come into contact with. Okay, now this section here, this is about the information revolution. And this is a section I actually share with my partner Kate Williams, because we're both professors at the Graduate School of Library and Information Science. And so we've attempted to maintain a collection that represents not only the empirical research, but also the theoretical work. For example, the work of Manuel Castells in his multi-volume work on the Information Society is a very real and important part of our collection. But also we have anthologies such as The Cutting Edge and the work of Brian Loader, where Kate and I have articles included in these anthologies. So this is basically also Jeremy Rifkin, Howard Rheingold, and many others. So these three sections here, including the particular work that I'm interested in particular the relationship between information technology and African American studies, which we're calling E-Black. So we have a special section here dealing with information technology in Africa and the Caribbean, and then also all the material, research material that comes out of the Black Library movement, like E.J. Josey and others, as well as all the material being done on research material being done on the African American experience and racism in cyberspace and the internet. And that's all here. This section is a special section on Chicago and the state of Illinois. Because I'm from Chicago and we went to school at the University of Chicago, and there's a lot of research done on Chicago. This is too big to have in the urban section that we discussed earlier. And so all of this is the research done on Chicago, including work such as this book by Christopher Reed, which is volume 1 of his multi-volume series on the history of Black Chicago. And what's interesting about Christopher Reed is we were classmates at Marshall High School in Chicago, and he ended up being a professor of history at Roosevelt University in Chicago. Also, as part of this, we've got our own work. This is a study that I did with Doug Gills on Harold Washington and the crisis of Black power in Chicago. This discusses the history of Black power in Chicago and the rise of Harold Washington and how he got elected. Then in addition to Chicago, we also look at New Philadelphia, which is the town created by my great-great-grandfather, which was the first town legally incorporated by an African American in the United States. This book, by my first cousin Juliet Walker, Free Frank, is the story of this man and his founding of the town. She did her dissertation at the University of Chicago under John Hope Franklin, and this is the book that came out of her dissertation. But even before her, Helen McWhorter Simpson, who was living in Cleveland, put this book together. This is a self-published book, and she was the first McWhorter to graduate from the University of Chicago, and that was in 1914. And then subsequently her daughter graduated from Chicago as well. So our family has a long history with the University of Chicago. So this is an important book as well. But we also have other formats. For example, this Coppin the Ghost is a DVD of the photography of Bobby Senstack, who comes from the Senstack family that founded and ran the Chicago Defender newspaper. And he became a very important photographer as part of the black arts movement in the 1960s that I was very much involved with. So all of this has to do with Chicago and Illinois history. Okay, now this section is about black political economy. This is studies of the working class and black people in the trade union movement. And these notebooks up here, as I was indicating before in terms of collecting documents, this really is a series of collections that I had students create on cities in Ohio. When I taught in Ohio, we organized student teams, and so these are documentary histories of each of the cities in Ohio. This is part of really the plan that Black Studies should have been and could have been, and to some extent is implementing, digging out of the record the documentary history of the cities in which black people live. Every city has a story. So here are the stories of Youngstown, Oberlin, Dayton, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus, Akron, Findlay, and so forth. And so all of this is, again, this is the black business, study of black businesses and the middle class. These are all the census documents. And now we're moving into two sections that are important in terms of our community. One is religion. So these 7 shelves all deal with aspects of black religion, theology, Africa, the Caribbean, and history. And some of the books that I pulled out of used bookstores and so on to supplement the particular collection. For example, here's a 10-volume work which is a Jewish encyclopedia. That's very important. Here is 4 volumes on the history of the Jews. Because as we know, the Jewish experience is not independent of the African experience. And so all of the religions of the world are important in terms of studying. And here you have, for example, a Bible, which is the King James Version of the Bible, but it is the African Heritage Edition, which includes a lot of the information about the locations of the Christian religion in Africa. And so this is very important. And next to the religious section, we have the section on philosophy. And here we not only have the history of Western philosophy. I had a double major in college in philosophy and sociology, and so this collection begins in my undergraduate days. But also here, up here, and other places, we have a beginning collection on philosophy in Africa. And so we're not just looking at Kant and Hegel and Plato and Aristotle, we're also looking at philosophical ideas that are part of the African American experience. Okay, now down this side of this aisle, the focus is on black liberation. And we begin with 7 shelves in this whole case here devoted to Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. And we have the full range of material from strange little dolls that we've collected on eBay to stamps, to posters, to the collected works of Malcolm, as has been published, works about Malcolm, down to works about the Nation of Islam, including, of course, the publications of Elijah Muhammad. And this includes, of course, a lot of the work that we've done, which includes buttons, posters. There's a poster we did on Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And other documents that we've done. So, and of course we've got some photographs here by Bobby Senstak, his documentation of the Nation of Islam, that are a very important part of this collection. Okay, now moving beyond these Malcolm shelves, what we've got is at the top here, all of this is Malcolm X's words in different languages other than English. So we've got French, Spanish, German, Flemish, Japanese, Chinese. These are the works of Malcolm in the global context. And then here we have this entire shelf is Marcus Garvey and other important nationalists like Martin Delany and his work, Edward Wilmot Blyden and his work. And then we come down here more into the 1960s where we have Robert Williams and Harold Cruse. Here we have Paul Robeson's work. Here we have the work of more recent scholars, Adolph Reed, Cornel West, Robin Kelly, Manning Marable. And then we have, of course, the documentation of Malcolm here, all of the material that's been collected. Now we have this, plus we have 5 file drawers full of material documenting Malcolm. This shelf here, this complete shelf, are the collected works of Amiri Baraka. And then here are this whole shelf here, and half of this shelf down here is the Black Panther Party, and the works of James Forman and Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and the Black Power movement, including the more recent work by Peniel Joseph, the early work by Robert Allen, all this material here. And of course, keeping a focus, we've got here the Afrocentric debate. So this is Ron Karinga and Molife Asante and the debate over Afrocentrism. Their complete works. The works of Diop from Senegal. The works of C.J. Mumford, which is a combination of Marxism and Afrocentrism. And of course, connected to the Black Power and the 60s and until today, we have the collected works of Michael Dawson, who's at the University of Chicago, and his very important recent book, Blacks In and Out of the Left, which is a series of debates, of lectures and debate at Harvard University. Very important. Okay, now, these next two stacks of 7 shelves each really have to do with more books on the workers' movement and the history of the communist movement. So, for example, we've got everything from copies of Capital, and one of the interesting things I want to point out is that this is one of the 3 volumes of Capital. It's a hardback edition. The personal copy of J.H. Jackson, the former president of the National Baptist Convention. So here was a time when black preachers coming out of the 1930s and the massive way in which black intellectuals identified with the left were intellectuals and therefore studied. And so he had his own edition of the 3 volumes of Marx's Capital. And now I have it. But the point is that this demonstrates something about where we were at one particular point in time and where we need to be again. not necessarily in any particular book, but as intellectuals that take up the radical ideas that are circulating in the world. And also we have here the collected works of Dimitrov, the great United Front theorist during the Comintern era, with M.N. Roy, Gramsci from Italy, and then all of the works of the great thinkers in the Vietnam experience, General Giat, and of course Ho Chi Minh, Trong Trinh, Le Duan, all of those great theorists of the Vietnamese Revolution. And then also Si Son, the theorist of the Filipino Revolution. And then here is about the U.S. working class, the Foner's 4-volume history of the labor movement. All of the works on political economy, not only by people in England, people in the U.S., and people in the Soviet Union. Okay, now, this particular aisle focuses on Marxism in the classical literature as well as the revolutionary movements in various parts of the world. This first section here, this is the collected works of Marx and then Marxism, including, some of the classical textbooks. This was the basic book that was published in the Soviet Union that was used as a textbook on Marxism really throughout the world, from the Comintern, the Communist International. So the collected works of Marx and Engels. And then here we have the collected works, the 45 volumes, the collected works of Lenin, and then all of the pamphlets and so on, the history of the Soviet experience in the Russian Revolution. Again, this is the classic textbook, The History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolshevik short course. This particular edition was published in India because they published things cheaply. We were able to get those books here in the United States. Here is the collected works, the 13-volume collected works of Stalin. One of our comrades went to China and in their foreign language press was able to buy this collection there in Peking. Then it was Peking. And then again, more stuff on the Soviet Union. Here we have China. These 7 shelves are all on China, including our collection of Peking Review and the collected works, the 5 volumes collected works of Mao Zedong, and then the histories of the various histories of the Chinese Revolution, including the important books by Han Suyin. This one is The Morning Deluge, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Revolution, 1893 to 1954. And then this one is Wind in the Tower, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Revolution, 1949 to 1975. Han Suyin, again, a very important chronicler and analyst of the Chinese Revolution. This is a volume that is a documentation of my first trip to China in 1974. This is a picture I took of Chinese workers on the Great Wall marching. And this is a detailed transcript of our conversations and the lectures that we were given. These 4 or 5 shelves here have to do with the Cuban Revolution. So we're talking about not only the historical analysis, particularly the Afro-Cubans, but also the Cuban Revolution after 1959. So here's the work of Fidel and Che, the studies, the publications. I've made maybe 15 trips to Cuba over the years. And so this is a documentation not only of books I bought here in this country, but a lot of the material in English and Spanish collected in Cuba itself. Okay, so that was Cuba. Now we have the West Indies and Latin America. Grenada and Maurice Bishop, Trinidad, Eric Williams and the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, and then down here in terms of the Nicaraguan Revolution and other Latin American revolutions. Now we're moving into the left of the United States, and these 6 shelves all have to do with African Americans and the U.S. Communist movement, including the works of Herbert Aptheker, very important historian, as well as the experiences of black people, people like Harry Haywood, people like James Yates, who was an activist in Spain fighting against the fascists, studies of the Scottsboro Boys, studies of the Reconstruction. Here's a study done by Nell Painter of Hosea Hudson, his life as a communist in the South, and so forth. So this is really the old CP in the United States, including analysis of blacks in Russia. So here, for example, is a book by Joy Carew, Jan Carew's wife, Black, Reds, and Russians, the experience of African Americans in the Soviet Union under the Soviet Union before it became capitalist. Now these next 2 shelves, and you can see it's not just books. This is really the record of what we call the new communist movement that developed in the after the 1960s, after the student movement and the Black Power movement began to confront U.S. imperialism and capitalism in the world. People turned to Marxism, inspired by the Chinese Revolution and the Cuban Revolution. So this is the experience of from SDS and SNCC into what we call the new communist movement. And so here is the Revolutionary Union and the RCP. Here is the October League. Here is the experience of black people. And then here is a 6-volume documentary history that I created on what we call the Search for a Vanguard. These are black organizations that were searching for a revolutionary organization, including the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit, or the African People's Party, the African People's Socialist Party, the African People's Revolutionary Party, and so on. So all of that's here. And then this includes the work of the Communist Labor Party that recruited many of the people from the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, including their chair, Nelson Peary. And all of these boxes here, etc., represent pamphlets, newspapers that document the history of these organizations. Now this section really has something to do with my graduate school, undergraduate and graduate school training, because it has to do with sociology and the social sciences. And because I got my PhD from the University of Chicago, there's a particular tradition there called the Chicago School often, and so these materials tend to focus on that. For example, this is the work called The Last Half Century by Morris Janowitz, a very important sociologist who I studied with. And so this is sociology, and here we get into political economy and history. I'm particularly interested in historiography, the theory of history. And this whole shelf here has to do with theories of history. And then this is all political economy. And now we get into the black experience, and though all of this is black sociologists. E. Franklin Frazier, Charles Johnson, very important work, including we have the work of William Julius Wilson, who came to Chicago and taught. It is after I left. And then also here are examples of Oliver Cox. I collected all of his material and put it in this notebook along with his published work. In addition, at one point I taught at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and this is from the Social Science Institute. This is published in 1946. These are mimeograph materials published in a historically black college. This is path-breaking research that otherwise, some of it has been published, but most of it hasn't. And so it's very important to, again, maintain these things. Again, here's a 1946 study of racial attitudes toward what they call racial attitudes towards African Americans. So these are very important primary documents, you would have to call them, that are not really found anywhere else. Now up here are notebooks. This is pre-internet. And so what we used to do is we would Xerox material and put it in these notebooks for our own personal reference. And so here you have black workers in the trade unions, black sociologists, more black workers, in this case black workers in the steel industry, analysis, class analysis. Here it's called periodization, problems of historical materialism. So these are all the notebooks that I have compiled during my research based on copying articles and other material. Okay, now this section really is about Africa. And we tried to organize it. So here we have the basic evolutionary material documenting the fact that all of our species, Homo sapiens sapien, comes out of Africa. And so there's a lot of research on this that has to do with not only archaeology but DNA research. Now here we begin, we've got encyclopedias and general histories of Africa. And particularly the material that came out of the socialist countries that represent a different kind of history of Africa than we get in this country. Now we go to Ghana, and because of Nkrumah and the importance of the Ghanaian Revolution, the first revolution in sub-Saharan Africa in 1957, this is very important. And so here is the collected works of Kwame Nkrumah and other research dealing with Ghana. Rattray, a British guy who did a comprehensive analysis of culture and social customs among the Ashanti and the Akan people in Ghana. So this is all Ghana. And then now we come to Nigeria and West Africa. And here's the work of Frantz Fanon and Samir Amin, who's Egyptian but who works in Senegal. And of course the work of Walter Rodney, who was a part of our generation and a very important scholar of Africa and the revolution, particularly in the Caribbean and Guyana, where he's from. And so all of this, and now these 2 or 3 shelves, this is all South Africa. Then Stephen Biko and Mandela and the research that deals with the industrial development. This, for example, is a documentation of the work of Willie Kotzatili, who is a very important poet from South Africa, who participated in a program that we had in our bookstore in Chicago. And so this is a documentation of his work because we used to compile research that had to do with the activities that we were engaged in. These are studies that were done. This comes out of the University of Natal. And so again, these are not material that would be part of the mainstream publishing. These are research materials that came out of research institutes, and etc. And this is a very important part of the kind of collection that we have in this library and that people have in their libraries, and this is a material that has to be preserved. Now, in addition, as I indicated earlier, we've got file cabinets full of information. These particular file cabinets really have to do with my activism in the African Liberation Support Movement. In 1972, we had a demonstration beginning the African Liberation Day demonstrations in the United States. And so we formed an organization called the African Liberation Support Committee, which really was a major movement that brought together nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and Marxism to a high tide of resistance in helping to move Africa from a colonial and neo-colonial state into independence, the fight for national liberation. So that's what these records are about. It's preserving the memory and history of that particular organization, the African Liberation Support Committee. One of the important experiences that we've had over the last few years is our relationship with China. Early on, it was the importance of the revolution led by Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai and the Communist Party of China. And this was a very inspirational experience for everyone, particularly outside of Europe, because it demonstrated the importance of the capacity of people to take history into their own hands. Well, in 1978 in China, and I had gone to China during this period, but in 1978 things changed, and Deng Xiaoping took over, and China began to move toward capitalism again. But in China there is a great debate around this, and now we have the information revolution, and so new developments are taking place. So Kate and I were invited to go to teach at Peking University, and when we went there, we also did a lecture tour on several universities in several cities throughout China. This poster, for example, is an example of Beijing Normal University, a speech that we gave called Rethinking the Information Revolution by Studying the Urban Village. So we were really talking about how working class people and senior citizens and young people can take advantage of this technology in China to improve their lives and to better aggregate their views and be able to advance their concerns, and by so doing rekindle the inspiration that was there under Mao Zedong. This section here is about a part of the African diaspora, mainly England. I had the opportunity of connecting with the Radical Black and Third World Book Fair in London. It was also in Manchester and other places in England, led by a very great man who taught me a lot, who was a friend, a comrade, a teacher, John LaRose. And this is actually a picture of John. And whenever I went to London, I would stay with John and his wife Sarah, and became close friends with particularly one of his sons, Michael LaRose, but also many others, Gus John being one of them. And all of these documents really have to do with the experience in the book fair. And the book fair was the kind of meeting place. It was sort of our version of the Pan-African Congresses. It was a global cultural, political gathering. And so people from the Caribbean, people from all parts of Africa, people from Asia, people from all parts of Europe, France, Germany in particular, would come. And for almost a week, we would talk, we would debate, we would celebrate, we would party, we would listen to poetry, we would see images and film. It was just a wonderful opportunity, and we need that again. Many people ask me, how did I survive during periods? And part of how I survived intellectually and culturally was going to London to the Third World Book Fair. And one of the interesting things is, every one of the book fairs would have a program. And this program would have all of our pictures who were participating, bios of everybody, and statements that would be made. And every book fair, there was always an opening address given. Wole Soyinka, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, C.L.R. James. Many people gave opening addresses, and I was privileged one year to give the opening address for the book fair, and it was really a high point in my life. And so all of these documents are really about that experience in England. I was also pleased that my partner Kate did her research for her PhD in England, in Manchester. and that enabled us to go to Manchester and live there as well. So there is you might say, a soft spot in our heart for the British experience, particularly the experience of people struggling as part of the global struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. Okay, so this section is the section of the journals. These are all the journals that I've collected over the many years of activity. For example, here you have the Black Scholar, virtually a complete run of the Black Scholar, and I was on the original editorial board of the Black Scholar. And so, but also we have things like, for example, this is a journal called Black Politics that was actually mimeographed. And so obviously this kind of collection, the grassroots, self-organized publications out of the Black Liberation Movement and Black Studies Movement would be important to preserve. Here we have Freedom Ways, which is another very important journal, but also because I was trained as a sociologist, I have the journal that radical sociologists created in the 1960s called the Insurgent Sociologist. The old journal that Carter G. Woodson created, the Journal of Negro History, now called the Journal of African American History. So all of these journals, there may be as many as 150 different journals included in this collection. And in this collection we have not only journals in academic journals and political journals, but popular journals like Jet Magazine and Ebony, which are really fundamental to black media history and information circulation in the African American community. We also have journals in Spanish and in French, international journals such as the journals that came out of China. Here, for example, is a journal, China Reconstructs. This was very important in my own particular intellectual history because China was such an important revolutionary experience in the Third World and inspired people throughout Africa and the Caribbean and certainly radical thinkers here in the United States. And so here are the journals in this collection. One of the things that was a main point of Black Studies is the need to document our own history, and in that way to really take possession of our history, to own it. And one way we've tried to do that is by using every form of documentation we can. One important tool has been the tape recorder. And so we not only have cassette tapes, we have audio, we have reel-to-reel in various formats. This goes back to the 60s and 70s until now. And so these boxes you see here are all cassette tapes. For example, this box has tapes of lectures that I gave in the 1970s. So here's a keynote on Fanon in 72, Brown University 74, Atlanta University 74, University of West Indies 1980, TV lecture, University of Louisville 1970, Institute of the Black World discussion. These tapes, and I have to admit that, are vulnerable because they are tapes that have been in these boxes for 30, 40 years, in some cases 50 years. And we don't know how long they're going to survive in this condition. And so we're actively thinking about how to digitize these tapes in order to preserve them. This is a very important aspect of what we're doing. Okay, in addition to the literature, published books, and journals, we also are building a family archive. My great-great-grandfather was the first African American to found a town legally found a town in the United States. That's one aspect that he did. The other aspect is he purchased 16 family members out of slavery, basically out of Kentucky. So we're building an archive. And for example, these two volumes are part of a series of volumes that we have put together documenting the research and experience of remembering New Philadelphia, which is the town that he founded. And so these black boxes really are where we are preserving our information. And for example, in this box, we have a lot of the old pictures of the 19th century and early 20th century in this collection. And we're very much part of the new effort to build the African American Museum at the Smithsonian, where the McWhorter family will be featured as one of the free black families in the 19th century. He founded the town in the 1830s, and so his grandsons fought in the Civil War, and the town has been recognized as part of the National Park Service Underground Railroad sites. And these are stories I grew up with, you know, that our family was part of the Underground Railroad. And so it's really interesting that now this is getting national recognition. So this is part of this collection, the family history, gathering the photographs, because some of our oldest relatives, just a few years ago, Alberta Ewing died when she was in, over 100 years of age. And her memory, as they say, when a senior dies, we lose a library. Her memory is something we really cherished, and so now we've got to really pay attention to the record, lest it be forgotten. These black boxes are my personal papers, articles I've written, speeches I've given, correspondence. And these are the notebooks that I have used over the years that represent my taking notes at meetings, at conferences, maybe a poem or two, and a lot of doodling, and a lot of lists that constantly get rewritten. I don't know how you work, but I work by assigning myself lists and priorities, and I'm constantly rewriting these lists and constantly reordering the priorities in order to get something done. What saves me is the old adage that if you want to get something done, assign it to somebody who's very busy. Well, I assign myself a lot. I assign myself a lot of stuff, and at least some of it I get done. And so that's what this represents. And it goes all the way back to elementary school, where I don't know if you still do it, but these were the books we used to get in elementary school. And when you were graduating, you would get all your classmates and teachers to sign and say something. And so I have the elementary school books for myself and my sister, based on our graduating from Edward Jenner Elementary School in north side of Chicago, when we grew up in the Francis Cabrini projects. And this includes, of course, my John Marshall grades, which I'm not going to reveal to anyone. But anyway, here's what I find interesting is that the more we dig out of our closets, the more we pull stuff together, the more it's amazing to me that bringing our memory into sync with the documentation of our history is really a very important reality check. Because often, I know myself, you start imagining your past based on what you would like it to have been. And there's some things you remember and some things you forget, conveniently. And what's helpful to understand how you got to where you are is to really find out where you were. And so finding pictures of what we looked like, what the experience was in Cabrini in the 1940s, and how we grew up in an integrated neighborhood of working class people. And my father was over there with the Italians stomping on grapes, making wine, which he called Dago Red. And they would sit around and put the wine in all kind of bottles and stuff. I mean, the real deal, including people who were just coming up from Mississippi. And my father, a rural guy from Illinois, he liked chitlins. My mother couldn't stand it. Her mama was German, and so we grew up with sauerkraut, and sausages. And so there was all that dynamic. My father listened to country and western. My mother had on 78s Billie Holiday and Charlie Parker. It was a very interesting experience. And it's only by embracing that experience that I can try to understand who the hell I am, and on that basis, who I can be, which is really the whole point for all of us, is who we can be while we're still alive. That is possible. Okay, now in addition to these books, a lot of this material, even the books and pamphlets, were collected around research or activist points of focus. And because I've been involved in the Black Studies movement from really day one, one of my goals, in fact, my next major project, is to do a history of Black Studies. And so all of these books you see on this wall here, as well as other material that's not just here, really represents about 80 to 100 boxes of documentary material on the history of Black Studies. And all of this material will be the basis on which I will write a history. Now, one of the interesting things, again, I taught at Fisk University, and it's often been said that African studies began at Northwestern University. But here's documentation of a program of African studies at Fisk University that predates what happened at Northwestern. So here you have a case where black people in an HBCU were in fact vanguarding the study of black people, and it was not waiting until the mainstream woke up and began a formal study. So Melville Herskovits at Northwestern did not start it. This was started by Charles Johnson and others. And of course, in addition to the documentation of the U.S., we have the documentation. So here's a prospectus on the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana, which was created by Kwame Nkrumah, guided by African Americans like Horace Mann Bond, Julian Bond's father, and St. Clair Drake, who created the sociology department at the University of Ghana and helped set up the Institute for African Studies there. So here's Black Studies. Look forward to this research.